The husband who wasn't there. A family daughter called me at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. That would change everything I thought I knew about life and death. Her voice was shaking with a fear I had never heard before, not even when she was a little girl afraid of thunderstorms. "Mom, something impossible is happening," she whispered into the phone, her words barely audible over what sounded like her own rapid breathing. "What's wrong, Maria?" I asked, immediately setting down the stack of math tests I was grading. After 32 years of teaching third grade, I had developed an instinct for recognizing real distress in a child's voice. And my 25-year-old daughter sounded like she was 8 years old again, calling me from school because she'd had a nightmare during nap time. "Dad is here at home with me right now," she said, and I could hear her moving around, probably pacing the way she always did when she was nervous. "He's downstairs in the living room, watching that cooking show he always watches on Tuesday afternoons." "That's completely normal, sweetheart," I replied, confused by the panic in her voice. "Your father always comes home around 3:30 on Tuesdays. His crew finishes the morning shift early that day. Remember?" But her next words made my blood turn to ice water in my veins, and I would replay them in my mind thousands of times over the following weeks. "Mom, that's impossible. I just saw Dad's obituary in today's newspaper. It says Roberto Rodriguez died 3 days ago in a construction accident at the Riverside Development Project." The red pen I was holding clattered to the floor, leaving a small crimson mark on the essay I had been grading about what students wanted to be when they grew up. Little Timothy Martinez had written that he wanted to be a construction worker like his uncle, and now that innocent sentence seemed to mock me from the paper. "Maria, what are you talking about?" I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange and far away, as if someone else was speaking with my mouth. "That's impossible. I made your father breakfast this morning. He complained about the traffic on Henderson Street, and he reminded me that we need to buy Carlos a birthday present next week." "Mom," Maria's voice broke, and I could hear her starting to cry. "I have the newspaper right here in front of me. There's a photograph of Dad, the one from Carlos's graduation last year, where he's wearing his blue tie. The obituary says he died on Monday at 2:15 p.m. when a crane malfunctioned at the construction site. It lists you and me and Carlos as survivors. It even mentions that he was a member of the Sacred Heart Catholic Church and that he loved to fish on weekends." Stood up so quickly that my desk chair rolled backward and hit the classroom wall with a bang that echoed through the empty room. Most of my fellow teachers had already gone home for the day, leaving Lincoln Elementary School in the peaceful quiet that always settled over the building after the last bus pulled away. But now that quiet felt ominous, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. "Maria, listen to me carefully," I said, grabbing my purse and car keys with shaking hands. "Are you absolutely certain about what you're reading?" "Mom, I bought this newspaper from Mrs. Martinez at the corner store, just like I do every Tuesday when I go to get groceries for the week." When she handed it to me, she had tears in her eyes, and she said, "Mia, I'm so sorry for your loss. I saw your father's obituary in the paper this morning, and I've been thinking about your family all day." I was already walking quickly down the hallway toward the school's main exit. my footsteps echoing off the polished linoleum floors. "What exactly does the obituary say?" Read it to me word for word. Maria's voice became steady and formal as she read, like she was delivering a news report. Roberto Martinez Rodriguez, age 60, beloved husband of Elena Rodriguez, and devoted father of Maria and Carlos Rodriguez, passed away suddenly on Monday, October 5th, following a tragic industrial accident at his place of employment. Roberto was a dedicated construction worker who had been employed by Henderson Construction Company for over 15 years. He was known for his strong work ethic, his love of family, and his commitment to his community. Roberto was an active member of Sacred Heart Catholic Church, where he volunteered with the youth group and helped with community service projects. He enjoyed fishing, watching soccer matches, and spending time with his family. He will be remembered for his generous spirit, his infectious laugh, and his unwavering dedication to providing for his loved ones. Roberto is survived by his wife of 25 years, Elena Rodriguez, a teacher at Lincoln Elementary School, and his 2 children, Maria Rodriguez, a recent nursing school graduate, and Carlos Rodriguez, a junior at the University of Texas at Austin studying engineering. Funeral services will be held at Sacred Heart Catholic Church on Thursday, October 18th at 10 a.m., followed by burial at Sunset Memorial Gardens. In lieu of flowers, the family requests donations be made to the Sacred Heart Church Building Fund. By the time Maria finished reading, I had reached my car in the school parking lot. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped my keys twice before I managed to unlock the door. The obituary was so detailed, so accurate in every particular, that it couldn't possibly be some kind of mistake or coincidence. It mentioned details that only someone who knew Roberto intimately would know, like his volunteer work with the church youth group, which he had been doing quietly for 3 years, without ever talking about it much at home. Maria, "I'm coming home right now," I said, starting the engine of my 10-year-old Honda Civica. "Don't say anything to your father about this until I get there. I need to see this newspaper myself, and I need to figure out what's going on." "Mom, what if Dad asks me why I look upset? He's already noticed that something is wrong." When I came back from the store, he asked me why I looked like I'd seen a ghost. The irony of that phrase hit me like a physical blow. "Just tell him you had a headache or something. I'll be home in 20 minutes. The drive from Lincoln Elementary to our small house in the Riverside neighborhood normally took 15 minutes, but that afternoon it felt like it took hours. Every red light seemed to last forever, and every familiar landmark looked strange and ominous. I passed Henderson Construction Company's main office, a low brick building where Roberto had gone countless times to pick up his paychecks and get his work assignments. The building looked perfectly normal, with workers, trucks parked outside, and the usual bustle of activity that indicated a thriving business. Nothing suggested that they had just lost one of their long-term employees in a tragic accident. I turned onto our street, Maple Avenue, where Roberto and I had lived for 12 years. Ever since Carlos started high school and we wanted him to be in the better school district, the neighborhood was quiet and peaceful, with neat lawns and modest 2-story houses that represented the American dream for families like ours, working class, people who had managed to buy their own homes and build stable lives for their children. As I pulled into our driveway, I could see Roberto through the living room window. He was sitting in his favorite recliner, the brown leather one we had bought on sale at a furniture store 3 years ago, and he was indeed watching his Tuesday afternoon cooking show. He looked perfectly normal and alive, gesturing at the television screen the way he always did when the chef did something he disagreed with. I sat in the car for a moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This was definitely Roberto. I could recognize his profile, the way he held his shoulders, the habitual way he ran his hand through his graying hair when he was concentrating. But, according to the newspaper Maria had found, this man had been dead for 3 days. Maria met me at the front door before I could even turn my key in the lock. Her face was pale and streaked with tears, and she was holding a folded newspaper in her trembling hands. She immediately pulled me into the kitchen and spread the paper out on our small dining table. There it was, exactly as she had described, a detailed obituary for Roberto Martinez Rodriguez, complete with the photograph from Carlos's graduation ceremony. I picked up the paper and studied every word, looking for some indication that this was a mistake or a cruel joke. But everything was accurate, down to the smallest details about Roberto's life and family. Maria, when did you buy this newspaper? About an hour ago at Mrs. Martinez's store on the corner. It's today's edition of the San Antonio Express News, Tuesday, October 16th. I looked at the date on the newspaper header, Tuesday, October 16th, 2018, and the obituary clearly stated that Roberto had died on Monday, October 15th. But I distinctly remembered having breakfast with Roberto that Monday morning, just 24 hours ago. We had discussed our plans for the weekend, and he had mentioned that his construction crew was starting a new project that would keep him busy for the next several weeks. "Has your father said anything unusual today?" I asked Maria, keeping my voice low even though we were in the kitchen and Roberto was in the living room with the television volume turned up. "That's the thing, Mom. He's been acting a little strange ever since he came home. When I asked him how his day went at work, he looked confused for a moment, like he didn't understand the question. Then he said, 'Work was fine, Mia. Just the usual,' but he said it in a way that sounded like he was reciting lines from a play. I felt a chill run down my spine. Roberto always had specific stories to tell about his work days, which coworkers had done what problems they had encountered, what progress they had made on their current projects. He was naturally talkative about his job, proud of the buildings and structures he helped create around San Antonio. What else? I prompted. "He's wearing a shirt I've never seen before," Maria continued, glancing toward the living room to make sure Roberto couldn't hear us. "It's a light blue button-down shirt, really nice quality, but I know for a fact that Dad doesn't own anything like that. You know how he is about clothes. He has about 6 work shirts and 3 nice shirts for church and special occasions. And I know every single one of them because I'm the one who does the laundry." She was right. Roberto was not a man who cared much about fashion or expanding his wardrobe. He bought practical clothes that lasted a long time, and he wore them until they were beyond repair. The idea that he would suddenly appear with a new shirt was almost as strange as the obituary itself. And Mom, there's something else. When he hugged me earlier, he smelled different. Not bad, different. Just ... different. Like a cologne or soap that he's never used before. I walked quietly to the doorway between the kitchen and living room and observed my husband. He looked exactly like Roberto. Same slightly receding hairline, same strong shoulders from years of construction work, same way of sitting with one ankle crossed over the opposite knee. But as I watched him, I began to notice subtle things that seemed off. He was watching the cooking show with more attention than usual, as if he was actually learning something rather than just relaxing after work. Roberto normally used the cooking show as background noise while he dozed in his chair, but this man was sitting upright and seemed genuinely engaged with what the chef was demonstrating. "Roberto," I called out, "how was your day?" He turned toward me with a smile that was warm and familiar, yet somehow not quite right. "Elena, mi amor. It was a good day. I'm glad to be home with my beautiful family." Roberto almost never called me mi amor. His usual term of endearment for me was mi corazón, my heart, and while he often expressed appreciation for our family, he rarely did it in such formal, almost poetic language. Roberto was a man of few words, practical and straightforward in his communication. "Did anything interesting happen at the construction site?" I asked, moving closer to get a better look at him. "Nothing out of the ordinary," he replied, but again I had the feeling that he was being evasive rather than genuinely answering my question. "Just the usual work. You know how it is." But I did know how it was, which was why his answer bothered me. Roberto usually came home with specific stories. Miguel had told a funny joke. The new cement mixer was giving them problems. They had finished pouring the foundation for the east wing. The inspector had approved their work on the second floor. Construction work is full of daily challenges and small victories, and Roberto typically shared these details with genuine enthusiasm. "Primera wale kid, Obert." Hyman leaned down to give him a kiss on the cheek, partly out of normal affection and partly to see if Maria was right about him smelling different. She was, instead of the familiar scent of sawdust, concrete dust, and the Old Spice aftershave he had used for 15 years. Roberto smelled like expensive soap and a cologne I didn't recognize. "Roberto, did you stop somewhere after work today? Maybe to run an errand or see someone?" He looked puzzled by the question. "No, Elena. I came straight home like always." "Why do you ask? You just smell like you've been somewhere different." He laughed, but it sounded slightly forced. "Maybe I picked up some smell from one of the guys at work. You know how it is on a construction crew. Everyone uses different products." That was a reasonable explanation, but it didn't feel right. In 15 years of marriage to a construction worker, I had never known Roberto to come home smelling like anything other than his work and his usual personal care products. That evening, we had dinner as a family. Just the three of us since Carlos was still at college in Austin. Roberto seemed more attentive than usual, asking Maria detailed questions about her job search and her plans for the future. He listened to her answers with intense focus, as if he was genuinely fascinated by every word she said. Under normal circumstances, I would have been pleased by Roberto's increased attention to our daughter. But given the strange circumstances of the day, even this positive change felt unsettling. Roberto loved Maria deeply, but he had always been somewhat shy about expressing his feelings directly, preferring to show his love through actions rather than words. "Dad, you seem different tonight," Maria said, echoing my own thoughts, more talkative than usual. Roberto paused, with his fork halfway to his mouth. "Different? How, Mia?" "Just more." "I don't know. More present. Like you're really listening to everything I say. I always listen to you, Maria." "I know, Dad, but tonight it feels different." "In a good way?" she added quickly. "It's just not like you to ask so many questions about my nursing interviews." Roberto nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe I'm realizing that I don't tell you and your mother often enough how proud I am of both of you. Life is short, and we should appreciate the people we love while we have them." The comment about life being short sent another chill through me. I looked at Maria, who had gone pale, obviously thinking about the obituary we had read a few hours earlier. After dinner, Roberto insisted on helping with the dishes, which was unusual. He typically relaxed in his recliner after eating, leaving the kitchen clean up to Maria and me. But that night, he stood beside me at the sink, carefully drying each plate and glass and putting them away in exactly the right places. "Elena, do you ever think about what would happen to our family if something happened to me?" he asked quietly, while Maria was upstairs in her room. The question was so unexpected and so closely related to the day's strange events that I nearly dropped the pot I was washing. "Roberto, why would you ask me something like that?" "I don't know. I was just thinking about how hard I work and how dangerous construction can be, and I wondered if you and the kids would be okay if I wasn't here anymore." I turned off the water and turned to face him directly. "Roberto, has something happened? Are you worried about something specific at work?" He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in his eyes that I couldn't identify, a kind of sadness, or maybe regret, that was deeper than anything I had ever seen in him before. "No, nothing specific. I just want to make sure you know how much you mean to me, Elena. You and Maria and Carlos, you're everything to me. My whole life revolves around taking care of you." These were beautiful words, the kind of thing any wife would want to hear from her husband. But Roberto had never been eloquent about his emotions. He showed his love through consistent actions. Going to work every day, helping with household repairs, remembering to buy flowers on my birthday, teaching Carlos how to fix cars and throw a baseball. Hearing him express his feelings so directly and poetically was almost as unsettling as the obituary had been. That night, I lay in bed next to Roberto, listening to him breathe in the darkness. His breathing pattern sounded exactly the same as always, slightly irregular because of a deviated septum he had never bothered to have fixed. He was warm and solid beside me, taking up his usual amount of space on his side of our queen-size mat. Every physical detail was exactly right, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. I must have dozed off around midnight, because I was awakened by the sound of Roberto moving around in the darkness. I opened my eyes and saw him standing by the bedroom window, looking out at our backyard. The moonlight was bright enough that I could see his silhouette clearly. "Roberto, what's wrong? Can't you sleep?" "I was just looking at the garden," A sighed softly. "You've worked so hard to make it beautiful. I don't think I've ever told you how much I appreciate everything you do to make our house a home." Again, this was the kind of sentiment that should have made me happy. Roberto did appreciate my efforts to maintain our home and garden, but he had never been the type to stand at windows in the middle of the night, having philosophical thoughts about domestic life. "Come back to bed," I said. "You have to work tomorrow." "Yes, work," he repeated, but in a strange tone, as if the concept of work was somehow foreign to him. The next morning, Wednesday, I woke up before Roberto and went to the kitchen to start coffee. While I was waiting for it to brew, I decided to call Roberto's construction company. I needed to know if there had been any kind of accident, any incident that might explain the obituary Maria had found. I dialed the number 4 Henderson Construction Company and asked to speak with Tony Morales, Roberto's supervisor for the past 5 years. "Henderson Construction. This is Tony." "Hi, Tony. This is Elena Rodriguez, Roberto's wife. I wanted to check on something." "Elena." Tony's voice became immediately somber and sympathetic. "I'm so sorry I haven't called you yet. I've been meaning to, but to be honest, I didn't know what to say. How are you holding up?" My heart started pounding. "Tony, what are you talking about?" There was a long pause. "Elena, I thought you knew. Roberto died on Monday in that terrible accident with the crane. The funeral is tomorrow, isn't it? We've all been talking about taking up a collection to help with expenses." I gripped the phone so tightly that my knuckles turned white. "Tony, what accident? What are you talking about?" "Elena, honey, are you okay? You sound confused. Roberto was killed when the crane cable snapped on Monday afternoon. He was underneath the boom when it fell. We called the ambulance immediately, but there was nothing they could do. I identified his body myself at the hospital. I had to sit down at the kitchen table to keep from collapsing." "Tony, are you absolutely certain it was Roberto?" "Elena, I've worked with Roberto for 15 years. Of course, I'm certain. Listen, if you need anything at all, you just call me, okay? Roberto was like a brother to me, and his family is my family." I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet kitchen, trying to process what Tony had told me. According to Roberto's supervisor, my husband had died on Monday afternoon in a construction accident, but Roberto had come home Monday evening, eaten dinner with us, watched television, and slept beside me Monday night. I heard footsteps on the stairs, and Roberto appeared in the kitchen, already dressed for work in clean jeans and a flannel shirt I recognized from his usual wardrobe. "Buenos días. Mi corazón es ahí," giving me a kiss on the forehead. Mi corazón, his normal term of endearment, not the formal mi amor he had used the day before. But somehow, even hearing the familiar phrase didn't reassure me. "Roberto, can I ask you something?" "Of course, Elena. Do you remember what you did on Monday?" He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from me at the table. "Monday? Let me think. Monday I went to work, came home, had dinner with you and Maria. We watched that movie on television. The one with the car Why, do you ask? Do you remember anything specific about work on Monday? What project you were working on? What you accomplished that day? Roberto frowned, as if he was concentrating hard on the question. We were working on the foundation for the new office building, pouring concrete, I think. It was a normal day, Elena. Why are you asking me these questions? But Tony had told me that Roberto died when a crane malfunctioned, which suggested they were doing vertical construction, not foundation work. Foundation work typically didn't require the use of large cranes. Roberto, what's the name of the project you're working on? The Riverside Development Project, he said. But there was a slight hesitation, as if he had to think about it. That was the same project name mentioned in the obituary. But Roberto should know the name of his current job site without having to think about it. Construction workers typically work on one major project at a time, and the project name becomes part of their daily vocabulary. After Roberto left for work, I called Lincoln Elementary and told the principal that I needed to take a personal day. I couldn't concentrate on teaching when my entire understanding of reality was being challenged. Instead, I decided to drive to the Riverside Development Project to see for myself what was happening there. The construction site was a large lot on the south side of San Antonio, where a new office complex was being built. I parked across the street and watched the workers for nearly an hour. I could see the crane that Tony had mentioned, a large piece of yellow machinery that was indeed being used to lift steel beams and concrete blocks to the upper floors of the partially completed building. I didn't see Roberto among the workers, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. Construction sites are large, and workers move around constantly, depending on what tasks they need to complete. Finally, I gathered my courage and walked onto the site. I found Tony Morales near a trailer that served as the on-site office. "Tony, it's Elena Rodriguez," I called out to him. He turned around, and his face went completely white when he saw me. "Elena, what are you doing here? I need to talk to you about Roberto." Tony looked around nervously, as if he was afraid someone might overhear us. "Elena, maybe we should talk somewhere private. Come into the office trailer." The trailer was small and cramped, filled with blueprints, safety equipment, and the usual paperwork that accompanied a major construction project. Tony closed the door behind us and looked at me with a mixture of confusion and concern. "Elena, I have to ask, are you feeling okay? You sounded strange on the phone this morning." "Tony, I need you to tell me exactly what happened to Roberto on Monday." "Elena, honey, I told you on the phone. Roberto was killed when the crane cable snapped. The boom fell and crushed him. It was instant. He didn't suffer." "Where exactly did this happen?" Tony walked over to a blueprint tacked to the wall and pointed to a specific area. "Right here, on the north side of the building. We were lifting steel beams to the third floor when the cable gave way. Roberto was guiding the beams into position when it happened." "What time did the accident occur?" "About 2:15 in the afternoon. We called 911 immediately, and the paramedics arrived within 10 minutes, but there was nothing they could do." "Tony, Did you personally see Roberto's body? Tony stared at me as if I had asked him something incomprehensible. Elena, of course, I saw his body. I rode with him in the ambulance, and I stayed with him at the hospital until the coroner arrived. I was the one who called his emergency contact number, but I got voicemail, so I had to wait until the police could reach you. But nobody reached me. Tony, nobody called me about any accident. Elena, the police said they spoke with you on Monday evening. Officer Martinez said you were very upset, which was completely understandable. I felt like the world was spinning around me. Tony, I never spoke to any police officer. Nobody called me about Roberto having an accident. Tony walked over to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder. Elena, I have the incident report right here. It lists you as next of kin, and there's a note that says you were notified on Monday at 6:30 p.m. He showed me an official-looking document with Roberto's full name, our home address, and a detailed description of the accident. At the bottom of the form, someone had written, "Next of kin wife, notified by Officer Martinez at 18:30 hours. Wife became very emotional and requested time to process the information before making arrangements." Tony, I swear to you, nobody called me about this. I was at home Monday evening, and Roberto came home from work at his usual time. We had dinner together. Tony sat down heavily in a metal folding chair. Elena, I think you might be in shock. Sometimes when people experience a traumatic loss, their minds try to protect them by creating memories that aren't real. Maybe you should talk to someone, a counselor or a doctor. Tony, what if I told you that Roberto came home Monday night and Tuesday, and that he's at home right now, getting ready to come to work today? Elena, that's impossible. I saw Roberto's body. I watched them load him into the coroner's van. I signed papers at the hospital confirming his identity. I realized that trying to convince Tony of what I had experienced was hopeless. From his perspective, he had witnessed Roberto's death and had followed all the proper procedures for handling a workplace fatality. My claims that Roberto was still alive must have sounded like the desperate fantasies of a grieving widow in denial. But I knew what I had seen and experienced. I had lived with Roberto for 25 years. I knew the weight of his body when he rolled over in bed, the sound of his breathing, the way he hummed quietly to himself when he was in a good mood. The man who had been living in my house for the past 2 days was Roberto, in every detail I could identify. Tony, can I see where the accident happened? Elena, I don't think that's a good idea. It might be too upsetting for you. Please, I need to see it. Reluctantly, Tony led me to the area where the crane accident had supposedly occurred. There was a small memorial of flowers and construction hard hats that the other workers had created. Someone had placed a framed photograph of Roberto next to the flowers. The same photograph that had appeared in the newspaper obituary. I stared at the memorial, trying to reconcile its existence with the fact that I had kissed Roberto goodbye that very morning. The flowers were fresh. The photograph was clearly recent, and there was a small plaque that read, "Roberto Rodriguez, a good man and a good friend. October 15th, 2018. Tony, who brought this photograph? Roberto's work, body, Miguel Santos. He said he had it on his phone from the company picnic last month, and he had it printed at a photo shop so we could include it in the Memorial Miguel Santos. I knew that name well. He and Roberto had worked together for 8 years, and Miguel had been to our house for barbecues and birthday parties. If anyone would know Roberto well enough to identify his body, it would be Miguel. Is Miguel here today? Can I talk to him? He took a few days off after the accident. He was pretty shaken up by what happened. Miguel was the one who was operating the crane when the cable snapped. He blames himself, even though it was just equipment failure. I spent another hour at the construction site, talking to other workers who had known Roberto. Every single person confirmed the same story. Roberto had died on Monday afternoon in a crane accident. Several of them mentioned specific details about his funeral arrangements and offered their condolences for my loss. But when I returned home that afternoon, Roberto's car was in the driveway. I found him in the backyard, working in my garden. He was kneeling beside the rose bushes, carefully weeding around them and checking the soil moisture. This was something Roberto had never done before. He appreciated my gardening efforts, but he had always considered garden work to be my hobby rather than something he would participate in. "Roberto, what are you doing?" He looked up at me with dirt on his hands and a peaceful expression on his face. "I was thinking about what beautiful roses you grow, Elena, and I realized I've never helped you take care of them. I thought it was time I started paying more attention to the things that make you happy." These were exactly the kind of words any wife would want to hear from her husband, but they were so unlike Roberto's typical manner of expressing himself that they made me more nervous rather than reassured. "Roberto, have you ever worked in a garden before?" "Not really, but I've been watching you, and it doesn't seem too complicated. You just have to pay attention to what the plants need." I knelt down beside him and watched him work. His technique was surprisingly good for someone who claimed to have no experience with gardening. He seemed to know instinctively which weeds to pull and which shoots to leave alone. "Roberto, did you go to work today?" "Of course." "Elena, why would you ask that? How was your day?" "It was fine. We made good progress on the project." "What kind of progress?" Roberto paused in his weeding and looked thoughtful. We installed some of the framework for the upper floors. It's coming along well." But this was exactly the kind of vague answer that bothered me. The Roberto I had been married to for 25 years always came home with specific stories about his workday. He would tell me about problems they had solved, mistakes they had discovered, conversations he had with other workers, small victories and frustrations that made up the daily reality of construction work. That evening, I called my sister Carmen in Mexico City. Carmen had known Roberto since we started dating 26 years ago, and she had always been a good judge of character. If anyone could help me understand what was happening, it would be Carmen. "Carmen, I need to tell you something, but I want you to promise you won't think I'm losing my mind." "Elena? Me? Hermana, what's wrong?" "You sound terrible." I told Carmen everything. The obituary, the conversations with Tony and the other construction workers, the subtle changes in Roberto's behavior and personality. Carmen listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. Normally she would have interjected with questions and commentary. When I finished, Carmen was quiet for a long moment. Elena, what you're describing sounds impossible. I know it sounds impossible. That's why I need someone to help me figure out what's really happening. Have you considered that maybe Roberto is having some kind of mental health crisis? Maybe he was involved in an accident at work, and it affected his memory or his personality. But Carmen, the construction workers all say he died. His supervisor says he identified Roberto's body, Elena. People make mistakes. Maybe the body they found was someone else. Someone who looked like Roberto. Maybe Roberto was injured in the accident and has amnesia, and he doesn't remember what happened to him. This was a possibility I hadn't considered. Perhaps there had been an accident at the construction site, and Roberto had been injured rather than killed. Maybe he had been confused or disoriented, and someone had made an incorrect identification. That would explain why he seemed different. Brain injuries could cause personality changes and memory problems. But it still didn't explain how an experienced construction supervisor like Tony could mistake someone else's body for Roberto, especially when Tony had known Roberto for 15 years. Carmen, there's something else I need to tell you. Roberto called you on Tuesday. Didn't he? There was a long pause. Yes, he did call me. But, Elena, it was such a strange conversation that I almost called you afterward to ask if everything was okay. What did he say? He asked me to tell him about your favorite things. He wanted to know what makes you happy, what your dreams are, what you'd like to do in your free time. I thought it was odd because Roberto has known you for 25 years. Why would he need to ask me about your preferences? My blood turned cold. What did you tell him? I told him about your love for roses, how you've always wanted to travel to Spain, how you dream of having grandchildren someday. But Elena, it was like he was taking notes, like he was studying to be your husband. After we hung up, I sat in the dark living room, trying to process what Carmen had told me. The Roberto who had called my sister was asking for information that my real husband would have known instinctively. After 25 years of marriage, it was as if someone was trying to learn how to be Roberto Rodriguez. I heard Roberto's footsteps on the stairs, and he appeared in the living room, ready for bed. Elena, why are you sitting in the dark? I was just thinking. About what? I looked at him carefully, studying his face in the dim light from the street lamp outside our window. Every feature was exactly right. The small scar above his left eyebrow, where he had been hit by a piece of flying wood when he was 23. The slightly crooked nose, from when he had broken it playing soccer in high school. The way his hair curled just above his ears when it needed cutting. Roberto, what's my favorite flower? Roses, he answered immediately. You love roses, especially the red ones you grow in the backyard. What's my favorite color? Blue. Light blue, like the sky on a clear day. What do I want to do when I retire? You want to travel to Spain and see the places your grandmother told you about when you were little. All of these answers were correct, but they were exactly the information that Carmen had given him during their strange phone conversation. I decided to test him with questions that Carmen wouldn't have been able to answer. Roberto, what was I wearing on our first date? He looked confused for a moment. I don't remember. Elena, that was a long time ago. Roberto had told me many times over the years that he would never forget how I looked that night. I had worn a yellow sundress with white flowers, and he had said I looked like sunshine. It was one of his favorite memories, something he brought up every year on our wedding anniversary. The real Roberto would never have forgotten that detail. But this Roberto, who looked exactly like my husband and knew facts about my preferences that he could have learned from Carmen, couldn't remember one of his most cherished memories about our relationship. "Roberto, what's our anniversary date?" "June 14th, he said immediately. "What year did we get married?" 1993. "Where did we go on our honeymoon?" Again, he paused, looking uncomfortable. We went to the beach, somewhere on the Gulf Coast. We had spent our honeymoon in Galveston, Texas, at a small bed and breakfast that Roberto had chosen specifically because it overlooked the water. He had saved money for months to afford that trip, and we had talked about returning there someday when we could afford a longer vacation. The real Roberto would have remembered, not just that we went to the beach, but exactly which beach, the name of the bed, and probably the name of the restaurant where we had dinner every night. I was beginning to understand that whatever was happening to Roberto, it involved some kind of memory problem. He could access basic factual information about our life together, but he couldn't recall the emotional details and personal experiences that made those facts meaningful. The next morning, Thursday, I woke up early and found Roberto already dressed for work. He was standing in front of the bathroom mirror, but instead of his usual quick routine of splashing water on his face and running a comb through his hair, he was studying his reflection intently, as if he was trying to memorize his own features. "Roberto, are you feeling okay?" "I'm fine, Elena. Just making sure I look presentable for work." But Roberto had never been vain about his appearance. He was a practical man who cared about being clean and neat, but he didn't spend time studying himself in mirrors. After he left for work, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. I was going to follow him. I waited 10 minutes after Roberto's car disappeared down Maple Avenue, then got in my Honda and drove toward the Henderson Construction Company office. I wanted to see if Roberto actually reported to work, and if so, how his coworkers reacted to seeing him. I parked across the street from the construction company's main building and waited. After about 20 minutes, I saw Roberto's blue pickup truck pull into the parking lot. I watched him get out of the truck and walk toward the building, moving with his usual confident stride. But then something strange happened. Instead of going into the main office, where the construction workers typically checked in each morning, Roberto walked around to the side of the building and stood near a chain-link fence, looking toward the riverside construction site in the distance. He stood there for nearly 15 minutes, as if he was trying to work up the courage to approach the building. Finally, he walked back to his truck and drove away. I followed him at a safe distance, wondering where he was going if not to work. Roberto drove to a small park on the east side of San Antonio, where he parked under a large oak tree and sat in his truck for over an hour. I could see him through the rear window of my car, and he appeared to be just sitting there, staring straight ahead. Around noon, Roberto drove to a Mexican restaurant called Los Com, where he had lunch alone at a table by the window. I watched him from my car in the parking lot, and I noticed that he ate very slowly and carefully, as if he was concentrating hard on the simple act of consuming food. After lunch, Roberto drove to Sunset Memorial Gardens, the cemetery where his obituary had said he would be buried. He parked near the main office and walked among the headstones for nearly an hour. I followed at a distance, hiding behind trees and monuments, trying to see what he was looking for. He stopped at a fresh grave site in the newer section of the cemetery. The grave had a temporary marker with a name I couldn't read from my hiding place, but there were fresh flowers arranged around the headstone. Roberto stood there for a long time, looking down at the grave as if he was reading the inscription over and over again. When he finally walked back to his truck, I crept closer to see the temporary marker. My heart nearly stopped when I read it. Roberto Martinez Rodriguez, October 15, 2018. Beloved husband and father Roberto had spent an hour standing at his own grave. I drove home quickly, arriving before Roberto returned. When he walked into the house at his usual time, around 3:30 p.m., he greeted me with the same warm smile as always. "How was your day at work?" I asked, knowing that he had not actually been to work. "It was good, Elena. We made progress on the project, just like always." "What kind of progress?" "Oh, construction work, moving materials, checking measurements, working as a team to get the job done." These were the kind of generic answers someone might give if they had no real knowledge of construction work but wanted to sound convincing. "Roberto, did anything unusual happen today?" "No, mi corazón. Just a normal day." "Why?" "Do you ask?" I wanted to confront him about the fact that I had followed him, that I knew he had spent the day driving around town and visiting his own grave, but I was afraid of what his reaction might be. If this man was not really Roberto, then I didn't know what he was capable of, or how he might respond to being challenged directly. Instead, I decided to call Carlos at the University of Texas and ask him to come home for the weekend. I needed someone else in the family to observe Roberto and tell me if they noticed the same subtle differences that I had been seeing. "Carlos, it's Mom. Can you come home this weekend? I really need to see you." "Mom, is everything okay? You sound upset." "I can't explain over the phone, Mio. I just need you to come home. Can you drive down on Friday after your classes?" "Of course, Mom. I'll be there Friday evening." "Is that okay?" I looked toward the living room where Roberto was watching television and humming quietly to himself. Your father is fine. I just need to see you." Friday evening, Carlos arrived home with his usual enthusiasm, carrying a duffel bag and a stack of textbooks for the weekend assignments he planned to work on. He was 20 years old, a junior studying engineering, tall and lean like his father, but with my darker complexion and curly hair. "Dad?" Carlos called out as he came through the front door. Roberto stood up from his recliner and embraced Carlos warmly. "Carlos, son, it's so good to see you. How are your studies going?" "They're going well. Dad, I'm taking a really challenging course in structural engineering this semester. It's making me appreciate all the things you've taught me about construction over the years." Roberto smiled, but I noticed a slight hesitation before he responded. "I'm proud of you, Carlos. Education is important." This was a perfectly appropriate response, but it lacked the specific enthusiasm Roberto typically showed when Carlos talked about his engineering studies. Roberto had always been fascinated by the connection between Carlos's academic work and his own practical experience in construction. He usually asked detailed questions about what Carlos was learning and shared stories about how those principles applied to his daily work. During dinner, Carlos told us about his classes, his friends, and his plans for the summer. Roberto listened attentively, but again I noticed that he asked very general questions rather than the specific, technical questions that would have been typical for him. "Dad, do you remember that project you worked on last year? The one where they had to use those special concrete reinforcements because of the soil conditions? My professor was talking about that exact technique this week." Roberto, no. Yes, that was a challenging project. We had to be very careful with the engineering. But Roberto didn't elaborate with a detailed story. I knew he could tell about that project. He had worked on it for 6 months, and it had involved solving several complex problems that he had been proud of. The real Roberto would have launched into a 15-minute explanation of the technical challenges and how his crew had overcome them. After dinner, Carlos helped me with the dishes while Roberto watched television in the living room. "Mom, is Dad feeling okay?" Carlos asked quietly. "He seems different somehow." "Different how?" "I don't know exactly. He's still Dad, but he's more formal, I guess. Less talkative about work stuff. And when I hugged him, he seemed surprised, like he wasn't expecting it." Carlos had noticed the same subtle changes that had been bothering me. Roberto was behaving in ways that were generally appropriate, but he was missing the small, specific details of personality and memory that made him uniquely himself. "Carlos, I need to tell you something, but I want you to promise me you'll listen to the whole story before you decide I'm crazy." Carlos sat down at the kitchen table and looked at me with the serious expression he had worn since he was a little boy whenever I told him something important. Explained everything to Carlos. The obituary, the construction site, Tony's account of Roberto's death, the visit to the cemetery, the subtle changes in Roberto's behavior and memory. Carlos listened without interrupting, his engineering-trained mind clearly trying to process the logical impossibilities in what I was telling him. "What you're describing is impossible from a scientific standpoint." "I know it's impossible, Carlos. That's why I need someone else to help me figure out what's really happening." "Have you considered that? Dad might have been in some kind of accident that affected his brain. Maybe he has a concussion or some other injury that's causing memory problems and personality changes. That's what your Aunt Carmen suggested." "But Carlos, his supervisor, says he identified Dad's body at the hospital. Multiple people at the construction site confirmed that Roberto died on Monday." Carlos was quiet for a long time, processing the information with the methodical approach he brought to engineering problems. "Mom, I think we need to get Dad to see a doctor. If he was in an accident, he might have injuries that aren't visible on the outside. Head injuries can cause exactly the kind of symptoms you're describing. But how do I convince him to see a doctor without telling him why? If he doesn't remember being in an accident, he won't understand why he needs medical attention. We'll tell him it's time for his annual physical. Dad always goes to the doctor once a year, right around this time. It was a reasonable plan, but I wasn't sure it would work. The Roberto I was living with seemed to be carefully maintaining the appearance of normal life, and a doctor's visit might force him to confront questions he couldn't answer. Saturday morning, I called Dr. Ramirez's office and made an appointment for Roberto for the following Tuesday, telling the receptionist it was for his annual physical exam. That afternoon, Roberto spent several hours working in the garden, showing the same surprising skill and knowledge he had demonstrated earlier in the week. Carlos joined him outside, and I watched them through the kitchen window as they worked together planting new rose bushes. "Dad, when did you get so interested in gardening?" I heard Carlos ask. "Your mother loves these roses, and I realized I should help her take care of the things that make her happy," Roberto replied. It was a beautiful sentiment, but Carlos looked puzzled by it. He had grown up watching Roberto appreciate my gardening from a distance, while focusing his own attention on household repairs, car maintenance, and other traditionally masculine tasks. That evening, the three of us watched a movie together, a family tradition we had maintained since Carlos was in high school. Roberto sat in his usual spot on the couch with his arm around me, and everything felt completely normal, except for the small voice in my head that kept insisting something was wrong. During the movie, a scene came on, showing a construction site, and Carlos made a comment about the safety equipment the workers were wearing. "Dad, is that the kind of equipment you use at your job?" Roberto watched the screen carefully before answering. "Yes, we always prioritize safety on the job site." But he didn't elaborate with stories about safety training, specific equipment requirements, or experiences he had had with workplace safety issues. The real Roberto would have had strong opinions about the safety practices shown in the movie, probably pointing out things the filmmakers had gotten wrong or sharing anecdotes about safety procedures at his own workplace. Sunday morning, Roberto suggested that we all go to church together, something we hadn't done as a complete family in several months. Carlos usually attended Mass with us when he was home from college, but Roberto had been working Sunday morning shifts recently and hadn't been able to join us at Sacred Heart Catholic Church, where we had been members for over 10 years. Roberto seemed less familiar with the routine than usual. During Mass, he hesitated before making the sign of the cross, as if he had to think about the sequence of movements. When it came time to recite prayers that he had known by heart for decades, he seemed to be following along with other parishioners rather than speaking from memory. After Mass, Father Miguel greeted us in the church vestibule, as he always did. "Roberto, it's so good to see you," Father Miguel said, clasping Roberto's hand warmly. "I was concerned about you after I heard about the accident at your workplace." Roberto looked confused. "What accident, Father?" "The crane accident on Monday. Several of our parishioners work in construction, and they told me about the terrible accident at the Riverside project. Thank God you weren't hurt." "Yes," Roberto said slowly, "thank God." But I could see that he had no idea what Father Miguel was talking about. If Roberto had been at work on Monday, when the accident occurred. He would have had his own account of what happened, his own perspective on the tragedy that had supposedly killed him. After church, we drove home in silence. I could tell that Carlos was thinking carefully about everything he had observed during the weekend, and I was grateful that he was taking my concerns seriously rather than dismissing them as grief-induced delusions. That evening, before Carlos returned to Austin, he pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Mom, I've been watching Dad carefully all weekend, and you're right that something is different about him. But I don't think he's pretending to be someone else. I think he's genuinely confused about certain things." "What do you think is happening?" "I think Dad was involved in some kind of accident or traumatic event that affected his memory and personality. Maybe he wasn't killed in the crane accident, but he was injured, and somehow he's been confused about what happened to him." "But, Carlos, how do you explain the fact that his supervisor identified his body at the hospital?" "People make mistakes, especially in traumatic situations. Maybe the body they found was someone else who looked like Dad. Or maybe Dad was injured and unconscious, and they assumed he was dead." Carlos's theory was logical and would explain many of the strange things I had observed, but it still didn't account for Roberto's obituary appearing in the newspaper, or the fact that his coworkers had created a memorial for him at the construction site. "Carlos, there's something else I need to tell you. On Thursday, I followed your father, and he didn't go to work. He spent the day driving around town, and he visited his own grave at Sunset Memorial Gardens." Carlos stared at me in shock. "His own grave. There's a temporary marker with his name on it, and fresh flowers. He stood there for an hour, looking down at it." "Mom, that's really disturbing. If Dad is visiting his own grave, then he knows something about what happened to him. Maybe he's more aware of the situation than he's letting on." Monday evening, I told Roberto about his doctor's appointment on Tuesday. "Elena, I don't need to see a doctor. I feel fine." "Roberto, you haven't had a physical exam in over a year. Dr. Ramirez says men your age should have annual checkups." "I don't like going to doctors. You know that this was true." Roberto had always been reluctant to seek medical attention unless he was seriously ill or injured. But eventually he agreed to keep the appointment, partly because I insisted, and partly because he seemed to understand that refusing would raise more questions. Tuesday morning, I drove Roberto to Dr. Ramirez's office, a small clinic in a strip mall where Roberto had been a patient for 8 years. Dr. Ramirez was a family physician who specialized in treating working-class families, and he knew Roberto well. "Roberto, it's good to see you," Dr. Ramirez said as we entered his examination room. "How have you been feeling?" "I feel fine, doctor. My wife thinks I need a checkup, but I don't have any complaints." Dr. Ramirez performed a routine physical examination, checking Roberto's blood pressure, heart rate, reflexes, and other basic health indicators. Everything appeared to be normal for a 60-year-old man in good physical condition. "Roberto, have you experienced any headaches lately? Any dizziness or confusion?" "No, nothing like that." "Any changes in your memory? Trouble remembering things that used to be easy for you?" Roberto hesitated slightly before answering. "No, My memory's fine. But Dr. Ramirez must have noticed the hesitation, because he began asking more specific questions. Roberto, what's your wife's full name? Elena Maria Rodriguez. What's your home address? 1247 Maple Avenue, San Antonio, Texas. What's your date of birth? Março 12, 1958. Where do you work? Henderson Construction Company. What's your supervisor's name? Tony Morales. All of these answers were correct, but Dr. Ramirez continued with questions that required more detailed memory. Roberto, can you tell me what you did last weekend? I spent time with my family. We went to church on Sunday. What did you do on Saturday? I worked in the garden with my son Carlos. What's your son studying in college? Engineering. What kind of engineering? Roberto paused for a longer time before answering. I'm not sure. Exactly. Some kind of engineering related to construction. But Roberto had always known that. Carlos was studying structural engineering specifically. He had been proud of the connection between Carlos's academic work and his own practical experience in construction. Dr. Ramirez continued the examination, testing Roberto's cognitive functions with simple memory exercises and problem-solving tasks. Roberto performed adequately, but not with the sharp alertness I would have expected from him. Roberto, I'd like to run some blood tests and possibly schedule you for an MRI scan. Sometimes head injuries or other medical conditions can cause subtle changes in memory and cognitive function. I haven't had any head injuries. Doctor, well, sometimes people don't remember being injured, especially if the injury affected their memory. It's better to be safe and rule out any medical problems. Roberto reluctantly agreed to the blood tests, but he seemed nervous about the idea of an MRI scan. After we left the doctor's office, Roberto was quieter than usual during the drive home. Elena, why did you really take me to see Dr. Ramirez? I told you, Roberto, you need regular checkups. I think there's another reason. Have I been acting strangely lately? This was the first time Roberto had directly acknowledged that something might be wrong. I decided to be partially honest with him. You have seemed a little different lately. Not in any major way, just small things. I was worried that you might be stressed about work or something. Different? How? You've been more interested in gardening, more talkative about your feelings. You seem to be paying attention to things you never noticed before. Roberto nodded slowly. I have been feeling like I'm seeing things differently lately. Like I'm noticing how beautiful our life together is. How lucky I am to have you and the children. That's a good thing, Roberto, but it's also different from how you usually express yourself. Maybe I'm just getting older and wiser, he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. That evening, Roberto went to bed earlier than usual, saying he was tired from the doctor's appointment. I stayed up late, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, trying to make sense of everything that had happened over the past week. I decided to call Tony Morales again, this time asking more specific questions about the accident and Roberto's death. Tony, it's Elena Rodriguez. I need to ask you some details about what happened to Roberto on Monday. Elena, Are you sure you want to talk about this? It might be too painful for you. I need to know exactly what happened. Well, like I told you before, the crane cable snapped while Roberto was guiding steel beams into position on the 3rd floor. The boom fell and struck him. It happened very quickly. He wouldn't have suffered. Tony, what time did you call the ambulance? Immediately after the accident, so that would have been about 2:20 p.m. And what time did the ambulance arrive? Maybe 10 or 15 minutes later? The paramedics worked on Roberto for about 20 minutes, but there was nothing they could do. He was pronounced dead at the scene. What happened to his body after that? The coroner's office took him to the hospital morgue. I rode with them and stayed until the paperwork was completed. Tony, did you actually see Roberto's injuries? There was a pause. Elena, that's not something you want to know about. Please, Tony, I need to understand what happened. Roberto was crushed by the steel beam. His injuries were very severe. There was no question that he was dead. But you're absolutely certain it was Roberto? Elena, I've worked with Roberto for 15 years. I know what he looks like. It was definitely Roberto. After I hung up with Tony, I sat in the dark kitchen, trying to reconcile his detailed account of Roberto's death with the fact that my husband was sleeping upstairs in our bed. I went to our bedroom and stood in the doorway, listening to Roberto breathe in the darkness. His breathing sounded exactly the same as it had for 25 years of marriage, slightly irregular due to his deviated septum, with a soft whistling sound on the exhale. I crept closer to the bed and studied his sleeping form in the dim lights from the street lamp outside our window. His hair was the same sultan pepper color it had been for the past 5 years, curling slightly at his collar where it needed cutting. His hands were folded on his chest, in the same position he had always favored when sleeping on his back. Even his unconscious facial expression was exactly right, relaxed but slightly serious, as if he was concentrating on something in his dreams. Every detail was perfect, but I could no longer ignore the accumulating evidence that something fundamental was wrong. The next morning, Wednesday, Roberta seemed more subdued than usual. He ate his breakfast quietly, barely responding when I tried to make conversation about our plans for the day. Roberto, are you feeling okay? I'm fine, Elena. Just thinking about some things. What kinds of things? I've been having strange dreams lately. Dreams about being in dark places, about not being able to find my way home. This was the first time Roberto had mentioned anything that might relate to the traumatic experience he had supposedly gone through. What happens in these dreams? I'm lost, and I can't remember how I got there. I can hear voices calling my name, but I can't tell where they're coming from, and I have this feeling that I'm supposed to be somewhere else. But I can't remember where. Roberto, do you think these dreams might be related to something that happened to you recently? Maybe something you don't remember clearly? He looked at me with an expression that was both confused and frightened. Elena, sometimes I feel like there are things I should remember but can't lie. There are blank spaces in my memory where important things used to be. This was the closest Roberto had come to acknowledging that he was experiencing memory problems. I decided to push a little further. Roberto, Do you remember what you did last Monday? Monday. Monday, I went to work, like always. Do you remember any specific details about your workday on Monday? Roberto frowned, concentrating hard. We were working on the upper floors of the building, moving steel beams into position. Do you remember anything unusual happening that day? There was some kind of problem with the equipment. The crane wasn't working properly. What kind of problem? I don't remember exactly. Something about the cable. Roberto was recalling fragments of the accident that had supposedly killed him, but he remembered them as problems that had been solved rather than as a fatal tragedy. Roberto, after the problem with the crane, what happened next? I don't remember. I think I came home for dinner, but I can't remember the drive home or what we talked about that evening. This confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Roberto had some memory of the accident, but he couldn't recall the hours immediately following it. This gap in his memory corresponded exactly to the time period when he had supposedly died. That afternoon, I made a decision that I had been avoiding for over a week. I was going to visit Sunset Memorial Gardens and look at Roberto's grave myself. The cemetery was a sprawling complex of manicured lawns and granite monuments on the south side of San Antonio. One had been there several times for funerals of friends and relatives, but I had never expected to visit my own husband's grave. I found the newer section, where Roberto had been standing the previous week, and I located the temporary marker with his name on it. The grave was well maintained, with fresh flowers arranged around the headstone and a small American flag planted beside it in recognition of Roberto's brief military service when he was 18. I knelt beside the grave and read the inscription on the temporary marker. Roberto Martinez Rodriguez, March 12th, 1958. October 15th. Beloved husband and father, he built his life with love and dedication. The dates were exactly right, and the inscription captured Roberto's character perfectly. Someone who knew him well had chosen those words. I noticed there was a small metal container beside the flowers, the kind people sometimes leave at graves to protect personal mementos from the weather. I opened it and found several items. A photograph of Roberto with Carlos from a fishing trip 2 years ago, a prayer card from Sacred Heart Catholic Church, and a folded piece of paper. I unfolded the paper and found a handwritten note. Roberto, I miss working with you every day. You were the best partner I ever had on a construction crew. I still can't believe you're gone. I hope you're at peace. Your friend, Miguel Santos, Roberto's longtime work partner, the man who had been operating the crane when the cable snapped. I put the note back in the container and stood up, looking around the cemetery. If this was really Roberto's grave, then who was the man living in my house, sleeping in my bed, and calling me mi corazón? As I walked back to my car, I noticed another vehicle in the cemetery parking lot, Roberto's blue pickup truck. I looked around and saw Roberto himself, standing about 100 yards away beside a large oak tree, watching me. When our eyes met, he walked toward me slowly, his expression unreadable. Elena, what are you doing here? I could ask you the same question, Roberto. I come here sometimes to think. It's peaceful. Roberto, whose grave were you visiting? I was just walking around, looking at the headstones. Some of them are very old, and they tell interesting stories about people's lives. But I knew he had been watching me at his own grave, just as I had seen him do the previous week. Roberto, we need to talk. About what? About what's been happening to you. About why you've been different lately. About why you're visiting cemeteries in the middle of the afternoon instead of going to work. Roberto sat down on a stone bench beside the pathway, and I sat next to him. For several minutes, we sat in silence, surrounded by the monuments to other people's lives and deaths. Elena, I need to tell you something, but I don't know how to explain it. Just tell me the truth. Roberto, I don't think I'm the same person I used to be. My heart started pounding, but I tried to keep my voice calm. What do you mean? I have memories of our life together, but they feel like memories of someone else's life. I know that I love you and Carlos and Maria, but it's like I'm remembering someone else's feelings. Roberto, do you remember being in an accident last Monday? I remember fragments of something happening at the construction site. There was noise and confusion, and then everything went dark. When he woke up, was walking toward our house, but I couldn't remember how I had gotten there. Where did you wake up? I don't know exactly. Somewhere on Maple Avenue, maybe a few blocks from our house. I felt confused and disoriented, but when I got home, everything seemed familiar again. Roberto, do you remember being injured in the accident? I don't remember being hurt, but Elena, sometimes I feel like I'm not completely here. Like part of me is somewhere else, somewhere dark and quiet. I took his hand, and it felt exactly like Roberto's hand, the same calluses from construction work, the same small scar on his thumb from a mishap with a saw 5 years ago, the same wedding ring we had bought at a discount jewelry store 25 years ago. Roberto, I need to tell you something that's going to be very difficult to hear. What is it? According to your supervisor and your coworkers, you died in that accident on Monday. They say the crane boom fell on you and killed you instantly. Roberto stared at me for a long time, and I could see him trying to process this information. That's impossible, Elena. I'm here with you right now. I know it's impossible. But, Roberto, there's an obituary in the newspaper, and your coworkers have created a memorial for you at the construction site, and we're sitting next to your grave right now. Roberto looked toward the grave where I had been kneeling earlier. My grave? Yes. There's a headstone with your name on it, and flowers that your friends have left for you. Elena, if I died on Monday, then what am I? It was the question I had been afraid to ask myself, but Roberto had asked it directly. I don't know, Roberto. I've been trying to figure that out for a week. Do you think I'm a ghost? I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but Roberto, you're warm and solid. You eat food and sleep and breathe. You're not like any ghost I've ever heard of in stories. But I'm not exactly like the Roberto you married either, am I? I had to admit that he was right. No, you're not exactly the same. You're similar in most ways, but there are small differences that I've been noticing. What kinds of differences? You're more emotionally expressive than you used to be. You're interested in things like gardening that never interested you before. And you have trouble remembering specific details about our shared experiences. Roberto nodded slowly. I can feel that there are things I should know but don't. Like when Carlos asked me about his engineering studies. I know he's studying engineering, but I can't remember the conversations we've had about his classes. Roberto, there's something else. You called my sister Carmen and asked her to tell you about my favorite things, as if you didn't already know. I called Carmen because I wanted to make sure I was remembering correctly. Sometimes I have information about you and the children, but I'm not sure if it's accurate or if I'm just guessing. We sat in silence for a while, both of us, trying to understand the impossible situation we found ourselves in. Elena, are you afraid of me? I considered the question carefully. I don't think so. Roberto, you haven't done anything to make me afraid, but I'm confused and worried about what's happening. I'm confused too. Elena, I want to be the husband you deserve, but I'm not sure I know how to be, Roberto Rodriguez. You don't have to try to be someone you're not. Roberto, just be yourself, whoever that is. But what if myself isn't enough? What if I can't be the man you fell in love with? I turned to face him directly. Roberto, I fell in love with your kindness, your loyalty, your dedication to our family, and your gentle heart. If you have those qualities, then you're still the man I love, even if some other things are different. Do you think those qualities survive death, Elena? It was a profound theological question that I wasn't qualified to answer. I don't know, Roberto, but I know that you've been kind and loyal to our family this week, even while you've been confused about other things. Elena, what if I'm not really Roberto? What if I'm something else that just looks like him and has some of his memories? Then you're something that loves me and our children, and that's what matters most. Roberto took my hand and held it to his chest, where I could feel his heart beating steadily. Elena, I can feel that I love you. Even if I can't remember exactly how that love developed over 25 years, he's dead. No, it's a beginning. Roberto, love isn't just about the past. It's about what we choose to do for each other every day. We drove home together, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I had more questions than answers, but I felt better for having talked honestly about the situation with Roberto, even if neither of us understood what was happening to him. That evening, Roberto suggested that we call Carlos and Maria and tell them the truth about what had been happening. I was reluctant to burden our children with something so strange and frightening, but Roberto insisted that they deserved to know. Carlos drove down from Austin again, and Maria came over from her apartment across town. We gathered in the living room, and Roberto told them essentially the same story he had told me at the cemetery. Both of our children listened with the same mixture of disbelief and concern that I had experienced when I first learned about Roberto's supposed death. This is really scary, Maria said, her voice shaking. Are you telling us that you might not be alive? I'm telling you that I don't understand what I am, Mia, but I know that I love you and I want to be part of this family, even if I can't be exactly the same person I was before. Carlos, with his engineering background, tried to approach the situation analytically. Dad, let's assume that you really did die in that accident on Monday. From a scientific perspective, what you're describing is impossible. Dead people don't come back to life with partial memories and personality.